The Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Tehan, joins me now. Tehan, welcome to 7:30.
Pleasure to be with you, Sarah.
Now, will you admit that what you really want here, to put it in the vernacular, is the scalp of a Labor minister?
No, what we want to ensure is that the Australian community are kept safe. And what we've seen time and time again is the Minister for Immigration to fail to keep the Australian community safe. That is what we want. That is why we have sought to work cooperatively with the government to fix the mistakes that the Immigration Minister has made time and time again, because we think any government's number one responsibility is to keep the Australian community safe, and that's what we want the Albanese Labor government to do. But the sad reality is this Minister for Immigration is incapable of doing that.
Now, what we just saw in that package there were the extraordinary revelations in estimates yesterday from the head of Mr Giles' own department that public servants had not informed him of these highly controversial decisions of the independent tribunal. Doesn't that absolve the Minister of complicity?
No, it doesn't, because before he made Ministerial Direction 99, which he signed himself on the 23rd of January 2023, he, along with the department, wargamed what the potential impacts would be. And he knew, and his office knew, that there would be impacts by putting in place this change, which required the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to take into consideration, required the length of time that a person had spent in Australia and other ties they had to the Australian community. Now, having wargamed that and known that in 25% of cases that could be potentially impacted, he did nothing to put in place any sort of monitoring. He didn't ask for an update after 6 months. He didn't ask for a review after 12 months. He signed that ministerial direction and then went to sleep at the wheel. And that has endangered the safety of the Australian community. And that is why he should hand in his resignation to the Prime Minister.
Let's talk about Direction 99, which sets the criteria for visa cancellations. The Prime Minister tells us it will now be revised to ensure that protection of the community outweighs any other consideration. Are you satisfied that that will solve the problem here?
Well, a couple of questions. We still don't know when this change will be made. We still haven't seen what the changes will be, and we will heavily scrutinise them, because every piece of legislation, every bill that the Minister for Immigration has brought forward to the Parliament, we have had to scrutinise to make sure that it does the job properly. And on all occasions, we've had to amend it or ask for changes to be made so that it will do the job properly. So the couple of questions we've got for when Minister Giles comes on your show are, when will he do this? We asked him that in the Parliament today and he wouldn't say it. And also, when will he make public his changes so that it can be properly scrutinised?
Now, just to be fair, because of course this is a highly complex area, that of immigration, and with this very difficult cohort. Now, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal has repeatedly overturned government decisions to try to deport criminals, to cancel their visas. For example, while Peter Dutton was in the Home Affairs portfolio, the tribunal decided that an Iranian ice manufacturer and heroin dealer should be allowed to stay. A Brazilian man guilty of armed robbery and assault should have his visa restored. A Nigerian heroin dealer in early 2020. Doesn't it show that when your government was when the coalition was in power, it was equally at the mercy of the AAT?
No, because after the AAT made decisions, the Minister more often than not would step in and use his powers to deport these people. Minister Dutton, or Peter Dutton, when he was the Minister, used those powers on 6,000 occasions, more than any other minister has used those powers to deport these non-citizens. Now, what we have here in this instance, and what has led to us to be where we are, is the very sad and unfortunate case of a Minister of Appeals Tribunal decision which used one of the primary factors, the person's ties to Australia, has led to an individual, a non-citizen, now before the courts for allegedly committing murder. And that is why Minister Giles should have acted last week to rescind this decision. We found out today on an ABC interview that he only called his department in to look at rescinding this in the last 24 hours. Once again, his failure to act is reprehensible, and that is why the Prime Minister has to show leadership and has to say that this minister sadly is not up to the job. And even though he's a factional ally of the Prime Minister, does his numbers for him in Victoria, this is the time for Prime Minister Albanese to show leadership, because he looks weak and the Australian community feel unsafe as a result of him not taking action.
But just to return to that question of complexity, because of course Direction 99, as we know it's called, was a variation on other directions that had been made under previous governments, including your own. It talks about a higher level of tolerance for criminals, but so did those previous directions. There's a very slight change in language. Before it was a higher level of tolerance may be allowed. In this case, it became a higher level of tolerance will be afforded. Is it just a small shift from coalition policy, not a sign of a government or a department out of control?
No, what it shows that the minister, through that Ministerial Direction 99, made a serious change to the way the Administrative Appeals Tribunal looked at cases. And as we've seen, this had serious consequences for the actions that the Administrative Appeal Tribunal took. And we now know that the minister and the government have woken up to this fact, and that is why they are now going to change this direction. Otherwise, they would continue on with it. And we also know that Minister Giles, when he made this change, he wargamed it with his department, and they said it would have consequences. Yet he didn't ask for a 6-month review. He didn't ask for a 12-month review. He didn't ask for updates as to how the Administrative Appeals Tribunal were interpreting the changes that he made. He fell asleep at the wheel.
Let's go to also how this particular change happened that we're talking about. Part of the motivation, or a lot of the motivation, for the introduction of this new direction was to deal with the very difficult issue of New Zealanders who'd lived their whole life in Australia, being deported, potentially deported to New Zealand. Do you really believe that a New Zealand citizen who spent their life in Australia is really New Zealand's problem if they commit a crime?
Well, under the previous regime, before it was changed by Minister Giles, the tribunal was required to maybe take that into account. Now, under the changes that Minister Giles undertook, that he signed, it said that they were required to, and that is what has led to these cases. Now, in one instance, we had that heinous crime where a stepdaughter was raped while the partner was giving birth to the child of the non-citizen.
If I may, Dan Tehan, I'm not denying for a moment, and I'm just interrupting you because I want to be clear about this New Zealand question, since that was where this change came from, and we're not denying the seriousness of those incidents. But let me ask you again. Today, the New Zealand Foreign Minister Winston Peters is asking Australia to take a common-sense approach to this change. My question is, would you be prepared, if you were in government, to say to New Zealand, we don't care, this is your problem, I'm sending this person back to you? Is that what you would do?
Well, that's what we did do when we were in government, Sarah, and you will remember that press conference.
And it caused a great deal of angst with the New Zealand government, didn't it?
Well, Sarah, we have a very, very firm view that if you're a non-citizen and you come to our nation, then you should abide by our laws. And if you don't, then you will be deported. I mean, that is the view that we take. There is a breach of trust with the Australian people if you come here as a non-citizen and commit a crime.
But we're talking about, in the case of the New Zealanders, sorry to interrupt, but in the case of the New Zealanders, we're talking about people who haven't come here. They've come here a very long time ago and lived their whole life and been formed and made in Australia. Those are the people that the New Zealanders are saying we should take responsibility for, but you don't agree.
Well, what I'd say is a couple of things. First of all, the ministerial direction that Andrew Giles put in place was not just about New Zealanders, it was about all countries. In one example, it led to someone who came here when they were 34 being allowed to stay in this country. And I will give you that example, and it is a terrible example, and I apologise to your viewers.
I wonder whether, I do beg your pardon because we're running out of time, so I might ask you to hold off on that. I think we understand that what you're talking about are heinous crimes.
No, but Sarah, if I could, but what happened was that the girl who was raped, the 14-year-old girl, she ended up having to go to New Zealand rather than the perpetrator. Now, that in no one's mind, and I think in most Australians' mind, is a fair outcome.
Dan Tehan, thank you very much indeed for your time this evening.
Thanks, Sarah.